So over the past few years, I have become very curious about the reasons that family wealth or family enterprise wealth, if you will, including a family farm, is unsuccessful transitioning from one generation to the next. And I've spent many years as a professional digging into what the reasons for that are and trying to dissect if there's a way to build a process around that. So, some of the reasons you're going to be very familiar with, for example, wealth preservation as a planning area tends to focus exclusively on financial wealth. That's probably the top cause of wealth destruction between generations. Families and their advisors also fail to appreciate that wealth preservation is a dynamic intergenerational process. Families fail to think long term with their wealth. This is something that we also know is one of the seven contributing factors to the destruction of wealth between generations. So many of you will be very familiar with some of those, but we also fail to tell our stories and we underestimate or shy away from the process of planning itself because it's hard work and it takes commitment. But one of the most important ones is that we fail to appreciate that wealth preservation is fundamentally a qualitative process and not a quantitative process. And in that scenario, we're dealing with decision making. And that's what I would like to deal with today. So, estate planning is decision making. And there are a lot of very important decisions that we have to make. We have decisions that are going to be made about effective communication, and we're going to have decisions that we're going to be made that are going to be influenced by the effective process that we have for the decisions we're going to make ourselves in this process. So, what are the kinds of decisions that we make while we're doing estate planning? And I'm going to focus on estate planning in this particular process because this whole seminar series is about people in farming and that it's about the people, it's about individuals. And I can't think of anything more individuated or more focused on an individual experience than estate planning. But for many, the estate planning process and the farm succession process are integrated. So a lot of the ideas that I'm going to introduce today are tied to both because many times they are integrated. So, what are some of the decisions you're going to make in estate planning? Well, who or what will be my estate trustee? I say what because you may use a corporate trustee. Who will be the guardians of my minor children? Which assets will pass to which beneficiaries? How will I use structures like trusts, insurance, and corporations to achieve my goals? Who will advise me on all of the various aspects of my planning? How can I be fair? Do I need to be fair or do I need to be equal? What if there's conflict in my family? What if there's cancer, divorce, legal incompetence, financial failure, substance abuse, general disinterest, or inability? What if I die before I'm ready? And what if I die and I'm left incompetent, which for many of us in our younger years, statistically, is the much greater risk? All of these involve decision making. And what I wanted to do was discover how good we were at that decision making and try and introduce a process that would make us better at that, to take away some of the things that introduce poor elements into the decision making process. So, decision making is also multidimensional and it's also multi layered. Every decision that we make impacts other decisions that we are being asked to make. So when you are deciding, what if you're asking yourself, what if there's conflict or tension in my family situation or in my family business situation, my family farm situation? Any decision you make on that is going to affect, it's going to ripple across the ocean, and it's going to affect who gets gets the assets, the decision about who gets the assets. And if you decide what fair versus equal means for you, it's going to trickle across and affect other decisions, such as who or what will be my estate trustee and who will be the guardians of my minor children. So none of these decisions that we have to make are determined in a silo, if you will. They are determined in in an ecosystem where decisions affect other decisions. So they're layered and they also are parallel at the same time. And so we have to have, we are very much benefited by a process that takes those kinds of things into account. So what I wanted to do was to create a novel approach to this, to take a look at our decision making and see if I could come up with a way, a process that would allow people, our clients as advisors, that would allow people to create a better set of decisions, to be able to rely on those decisions as being an improvement over the way they have previously done it. And what I did was I borrowed from the area of engineering. And in the area of engineering, they use what's called design process. And so I'd like to introduce that to you today as a better way to integrate the people in your plan and to improve the decision making in your planning. So I call it estate planning by design. Our first step is that we have to empathize. We have to find a way to connect to our family members, to our beneficiaries, to the eventual recipients of the shares of the corporation, if it's a farm corporation, for example, any transitional ownership. We have to find a way to empathize with those individuals, to figure out how they see the world that's in front of them so that we don't just see it from our perspective. The second step is to define the problem, to define our point of view. How are we going to tackle this problem? Third, we want to go through a process of ideation where we create ideas and we create different ways of tackling the problem and manifesting our solutions much later in the process than most of us that are, as advisors are used to doing. Fourth, and this is a bit of a novel twist, is to begin to model some of our planning, which is to say, and this is tricky, which is to say, to introduce some opportunities for the family to test run some of the solutions that we're going to put into place. And then finally, if we can, to actually test the final solution, maybe using a fire drill approach or some sort of other critical role-playing exercise. So empathizing. We have to remember as advisors that we are creating a plan for somebody else. This is their plan. It's not our plan for them. It is their plan. So we need to understand who they are, what motivates them, what their fears are, what their concerns are, how they understand their wealth to be valuable so that we can put in place a plan that actually reflects their goals for their beneficiaries and their purpose for the transition to wealth. Who are these people that we're working with and what makes them decide and choose? What I'm suggesting is that this first step of the process helps us to understand through empathizing how our clients are making their decisions. What's pushing their buttons and what are they avoiding? In this respect, I ask you to consider engaging in much more fierce questioning and much more fierce conversations than you might usually be prepared to do. And I'll move to that a little bit in the future part of this presentation. Be prepared to get to the core of their belief. In this process, we are not just ticking boxes and taking orders. We do no service if we're doing that. And that might include such usual areas of resolution as active listening. But I'm going to suggest that we go fierce on this and that we be prepared to ask questions that really get to the core and might actually upset the cart a little bit. One of the things we can do is we can ask why 5 times. So take an example where your client says to you, they want to keep things simple. A lot of times we just stop there. From an estate planning perspective, that has a code to it. That has a meaning to it. I know as a lawyer, that's something that I think about, and I have to resist the temptation to not simplify from my perspective. What I'm suggesting is we should try and understand why they want to keep it simple and what they actually mean by simple. So do you just stop there? Your client says to you, I want to keep it simple. I'm going to suggest to you, no. Let's dig into it and be fierce about how we challenge that that way they're going to characterize their estate. So ask why 5 times. If your client says something like that to you, ask another question. Say something like, tell me more about keeping it simple. Maybe the client responds to the effect, I want my executor to have an easy time of it. Don't stop there. Keep going. Now you're on to something. Can you elaborate on that more? The client responds, well, I was the estate trustee for my mother's estate, and it was a terrible challenge. Don't stop. Keep going. Share with me how that was a challenge. And they might respond, well, it was a lot of work, and my sister and I haven't talked so much since that time. It was very emotional. And what I will guarantee you is that if you stick with that questioning, and I say ask why 5 times, most of the time by 5 questions, if you're being sort of expansive and active in your listening, you're going to dig down to the core of the problem pretty quickly. And it will move from being a statement of, I want to keep it simple, to here are the reasons that are motivating that particular solution. And that's really important intelligence when we're doing estate planning or business transition planning for our clients. That helps us empathize with their motivations and their fears. Eventually, if you dig down and you're prepared to go down even deeper on those fierce questions and maybe push into areas where the client themselves doesn't necessarily want to go, you're going to come up with a qualitatively superior answer. And that, of course, is a much better starting point for in the sense of developing any actionable plan. In the empathy phase, our goal is to understand the point of view of the client. The goal is not to solve their problem here. We want to understand the values and the beliefs that the client has, including any unfounded limiting beliefs they might have about themselves or their family. You'll hear that. Assumptions they make about themselves, well, we can't do that, or our family doesn't do that, or I don't think my daughter can do that, or my son can do that, or that's not something they'd be interested in. You hear it, it's coded, it comes out. That's probably a limiting belief, and it may be very much unfounded. They may be making assumptions that are untrue. We can dig fiercely into that. They may also have dysfunctional beliefs about wealth and planning. They may have instead of an abundance mindset towards their wealth, they may have more of a scarcity mindset, and that can change your planning. I'm sure we've all worked with clients, I can think of some over the years, that actually had tremendous wealth and never actually had to worry about financially anything that they were ever going to want to do or be able to do in their lives. But they didn't know how to enjoy the wealth because they had learned and grown up with, through their families, through experience, with a scarcity mindset. They tended to fear losing the wealth more than they wanted to grow it and make it grow for their family as well. And finally, through this process of empathy development, we want to identify areas that are driven by emotion and irrational thoughts. So decisions are hard. Remember, 50% of adult Canadians, 50%, this was an Ipsos Reid poll done in April 2017, 50% of adult Canadians do not have a valid will. Of the remaining 50% that do have a valid will, 16% at that time reported that the will was so badly out of date as to be functionally useless. So almost 70% of adult Canadians have a will plan that doesn't reflect what it is that they really want to do. And that's a problem. So I think that's an irrational problem too. And when I say irrational, I'm really equating that with emotional. And there's nothing wrong with that. Humans are emotional. We make most of our decisions with our gut and our heart, at least initially. And the executive function of our brain kicks in eventually on some of our decisions. But it takes time, and only if we engage it with purpose and on purpose. And sometimes that doesn't happen. So a lot of people will equate emotional with irrational, and I think they do fit together. But irrational is not a negative thing. Irrational simply means that we're leading with our lizard brain, if you will, our immediate instinct to a situation. And so it's things like fear that will motivate a lot of those initial decisions. And the interesting thing about that is that we, although as creatures of, as decision makers, our initial reaction is mostly an irrational one. We respond immediately to something. We do so in a sort of systematic way. We do in a way that is predictable. And that knowledge of how we are predictably irrational is knowledge that we as advisors can take and help our clients build better process, so that the irrational things that are coming out, the emotional things that people, when they reflect on it later, aren't really proud of in some of their decisions and choices, is something that we can help them see for what it is: an initial reaction, a spontaneous reaction, and something that we can delve into and try to find meaning in, that really allows us to do better planning as we move forward. So what we want to do when we know someone is predictably, or people are predictably irrational, is build process for them that helps identify gives us a little bit of a beacon that goes off and says, okay, we're now in a space where this decision or this decision making area may actually be affected by what would be characterized as primarily initially emotional responses. And now we've got to engage the executive part of our brains through process. Because if any of you have read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, you'll know that he describes a system one and a system two. Our system two, our executive function, when we actually have to think hard about something, when a decision is difficult, and we want to go beyond just reacting to sort of the emotional impulse to something, flight, fight, those kinds of responses, we can do that. But that system, that part of our decision-making system is very lazy and it's very hard to engage. We have to engage it on purpose, and we often don't want to because it takes a lot of work, and it can't work for very long because it does use a lot of energy. It taps our mind, it taps our energy to think in that kind of way. So having process helps to chunk it down into smaller pieces, and it also allows us to stay on track, to not keep reverting back to the part of the emotional decision making that we weren't happy with in the first place. So these involves things like decision making biases and different heuristics. I have a book that is in progress right now that will come out this year, 2021, and it deals with the 10 estate planning mistakes that everybody makes and how to avoid it. And what it really is a book about decision-making errors that we make based on biases and heuristics, fundamental attribution error and confirmation bias and loss aversion, and how all of these various areas of decision-making that are baked into our brains can actually lead us astray in our decision-making. And that's something that I like to talk about when I'm talking about this kind of a process, making our decision-making better. And we're also very poor at math and probabilistic probabilistic considerations as well. We don't do particularly well with that. And of course, estate planning it can be mathy sometimes, if you will. So what are some things we can do? How can we overcome some of the biases and heuristics that are in the decision making with this first step of the process? And the first step of the process, of course, is the empathy stage of the design process that I'm suggesting you might like to bring to your clients. Well, ask fierce questions. Author Susan Scott wrote a book called Fierce Conversations. I encourage everyone to take a look at that. For advisors and family members, it's a great way to frame how deep we can go with our questions to get to the real root of people's responses, including family members. We should listen for what is not being discussed. What were we expecting to hear that isn't there? Or what topic area is the client completely avoiding? Many times we're happy to deal with that. We just zip along and we move through our own checklists. But we need to understand if they're building a barrier around a particular topic area, there's a reason for that. We want to get into that. Be prepared to do that and listen for that. If there are gaps that you can see, ask about those gaps in a non-technical manner. So, for example, if you see that in an estate plan, no alternative executor has been chosen, for example, ask why not. Ask why that wasn't done. That's an unusual thing to be absent from a will, but it might actually reveal a tremendous amount of information. If the client says, I couldn't think of anyone, go deeper on that. Why not? What was it that you couldn't come up with in order to give you that full, well-developed plan? Have a family meeting to share and discuss values and beliefs. That's incredibly important. And be part of that meeting as the advisor. And in fact, you might even want to get a facilitator involved so that you can participate in the meeting as an advisor and as an observer. Be mindful of questioning and planning the environment. Where is the decision making that you are doing? So if it's estate planning or business transition planning. I worked with some farm clients a few years ago, and it was 3 siblings, and I met all of them individually with their respective spouses and their adult children. And when I met them on their home farms, delightful, confident, hilarious people, told great stories. They were very, very engaging. Then when we met back at the home farm, which happened to be owned by the older, they were all equal equal farmers in terms of participation in the farm itself, and in terms of ownership levels, totally equal, on a technical level, totally equal. I meet them at the home farm, and all of a sudden, the two siblings that don't live there become somewhat, well, not somewhat, very subordinated in their behavior towards the one sibling that did live on the home farm. And I couldn't figure it out. I hadn't really ever paid attention to that before. And what I realized in retrospect after the meeting and after talking to some of my partners was that probably what was happening was the environment of the home farm came with the burden or benefit, however you would characterize it, of history. And that was the place where all the decisions were made. And whoever lived in that particular farmhouse in the meeting room we were engaging ourselves, which was in the main meeting room of the home, was where mom and dad always made the big decisions. And so the owner of that farm, even though they were an equal partner with their other siblings, carried with them the unintended benefit of the weight of and gravitas of that history. So after that, and I lost those two other business owners in terms of their engagement. They sort of subordinated themselves a little bit. So after that, we only had meetings in neutral sites, which was ultimately a liberating choice. They came back together again as three equal siblings, and it was much more dynamic and much more useful as a planning opportunity. Be the listener and observer, like I said. Maybe you can let somebody else facilitate the meeting so that you can be you during the meeting, and listen for what your clients are saying and not saying, rather than having to manage the meeting as it goes along. That's often worthwhile as well. And finally, avoid the instinct to provide answers. In this first stage, which is the empathy stage, we often are being pushed by our clients to come up with a quick solution. What's the technical answer? Resist that as much as you can. The technical should come later. And with this design approach that I'm suggesting, it actually comes much later. Resist that, because what happens with our clients is when they get the solution suggested to them, they tend to lock on it. There's an anchoring bias that goes with that. Step two, define the problem. Let's get some definition for it and build some walls around it. So we've passed from the empathy phase now into the definition of the problem phase. And this is where, as an advisor, you're beginning to articulate your point of view. You're going to create, or it's suggested that you might want to create an explicit statement of the problem that you're trying to address as it has been revealed through the empathy stage. So you've got a lot of data now if you've gone through this empathy stage. And you've probably got a lot of data from a lot of different participants in the decision-making process, multiple people from multiple generations of the family. This is the stage where insights and discoveries are revealed. It's an innovation for the client. And I think that's one of the nice things that's introduced by this process, is a bit of innovative thinking in estate planning or transition planning. It doesn't mean that the solution isn't going to be what you thought it was going to be all along, but getting to the solution is going to be a little different. And the family will experience as an innovative process for them, something that's a little different. So when we're answering and defining these things, there's a few things you're going to want to keep in mind. Who is the client? Is it the whole ecosystem of the family enterprise itself? Is it the specific parental ownership unit? Is it the next generation? Is it the business? You have to define that. And you want to make sure, because people are hearing your input and people are experiencing this in part from your perspective. Two, what is the genuine or authentic need of these clients? So once you've gone through the empathy understanding phase and you're creating your own point of view of what the problem is, you're going to want to identify what the authentic and genuine need is. That process of asking why 5 times, for example, gets you down to the nub of what's really motivating the client in this planning. They don't care. Very few clients are motivated by minimizing probate tax. That's actually not a very exciting thing. They are motivated about preserving their wealth so that their loved ones can do everything they want to do. Ask why 5 times, you'll get there. And finally, what's the insight that you've gained through all of these steps so far? So what's different? That's part of the point of view that you're going to want to bring in and be listening for and be able to articulate. And where we want to go with this step is after we've developed all of that, be able to put it into an actionable problem statement, something that we can say, okay, this is what we've got to do. So here's an example with this particular slide that I have. Emily needs insurance. Well, that doesn't do too much. Nobody purchases insurance. That is not going to move the needle if she needs it only, if that's how we're going to articulate it or how our point of view has been crafted. Of course, this person needs the insurance, but what's really driving that need for the insurance? Well, let's expand on that and improve our point of view. Emily, who is concerned about leaving a legacy, needs insurance. That gives us a lot more information, but there's still more to make it actionable and really helpful. And if we dig in that first phase, as we create our point of view, this will become a much more powerful statement as an igniter of action. Emily, the youngest of 3 farm children, did not receive an inheritance when her parents passed away. This made her life much more difficult, and she is determined not to do the same thing to her children and desires insurance coverage to avoid that outcome. Effectively, we're saying the same thing. The longer ones, the one that I just mentioned, gives a lot more detail about the emotional, if you will, even irrational motivations behind this. There was fear, and that's something that this client does not want to have happen to their generation of children. So what goes into creating a quality point of view? And remember, this is your point of view of the problem as it's been presented by your analysis of the client's empathetic needs as revealed through an empathy step in the process of your discovery. Well, a good quality point of view frames the problem properly and maybe even differently from what you're used to doing. It gives insight into what's really important to the client. It gives a basis for assessing and comparing competing solutions. It also helps to engage the client and the other planners and create a really effective multidisciplinary advisory team. It helps to align the stakeholders in the process of getting to a solution. As you all know, alignment is absolutely critical to making sure that we have forward movement in our planning. That helps us as we align everyone. That helps to get obstructions out of the way, or at least give us opportunities to plan around, through, or over top of those barriers. It also reveals parallel planning opportunities and needs that are going to be required to support what's going to be the core planning outcome. And finally, it should be discrete enough in its description and identification to be actionable. So if it's just Emily needs insurance, for example, that's not discrete enough. We can dig deeper on that. Step 3. Now we're heading into generating ideas. And this is where it starts to get really fun. So we've empathized, we've taken our point of view, we've seen the direction, how the client views it. Now we see how we're beginning to view it. And now we're going to start to go through the creative process. However, remember, the key at this point, and we're still early on in this process with our clients' planning, is not to try to establish the right outcome. We're trying to generate ideas. We're blue skying, if you will. Ideas that deal with the problem statement that come out of step number 2 are what we're looking for. We want to generate ideas that come from our point of view as we have interpreted the client's point of view. Innovation for the client planning starts to be revealed in this 3rd phase. Get different viewpoints as you're working through this from everybody that's going to be involved to deal with issues and opportunities. So that could include planners, other members of the decision-making team, of your own team, of the family itself and their management team, if it's if they have that, if they're that well developed on an administrative level. Involve as many people as you can that they want to involve. You'll be surprised and amazed at the level of ideation that can occur. And here's some breaking news for you. And this is something I've learned over doing this for 25 plus years, for too many years, is that most of the clients that we work with know what the problem is They have a sense of what the solution's going to look like. They don't necessarily know the technical aspects of the problem or the solution, but they do know what has to happen under any circumstance and what must not be allowed to happen under any circumstance as well. And that's really important for us to appreciate. So in the process of ideation, this phase is incredibly vital because in the decision-making process, we are now identifying problems and creating solutions. This is a transitional phase. We're moving from the creation area now towards execution. We're looking at solutions as conceptual solutions. So we're not yet fixating down on what the technical pieces of this are going to look like. How can we do this? How do we begin to generate ideas? What tools can we use? Well, I'll be happy to share these with you in a piece that I can accompany with this presentation. But some ways may include brainstorming, building a sample outcome or a prototype, and then ripping it apart, mind mapping, using a 6-3-5 approach, or creating storyboards. It doesn't matter. Whatever the process you have of creating blue sky ideas and getting it up onto a board and beginning to discuss them will work. And remember, there's no evaluation or judgment at this phase. We're just creating ideas. So what are some things that emerge from this particular phase? Well, we're going to move off the typical solution or the obvious solution. And as advisors, you'll know that solution right away. We're trained to do that. Client's going to share with us what they'd like to do, what their concerns and fears are. We're really experienced. We know what we're doing in our professional areas. We can see a solution almost immediately. We're trying to stop that process a little bit. We want to move off of that a little bit. And instead of going to the obvious or typical solution, give some room for different ideation to be brought into this. We're going to try and take advantage of some of the revelations that might occur from the collective wisdom of the family, the client, the professional team that you've got surrounding the client, and any other members of the multidisciplinary advisory team that are working this family farm ecosystem. What's in it for you? Well, you're going to have fresh sources revealed to you of value that you can provide above and beyond what your natural value proposition might be. You're going to be able to enhance your own toolkit of solutions. As Abraham Maslow said, as he's probably apocryphally, but famously, it's attributed to him. If the only toolkit in your only tool in your toolkit is a hammer, after a while, all of the problems that you face begin to look like a nail, and we just bash away at them. So if you're a lawyer, you bash away with legal solutions. If you're an accountant, you bash away with tax planning solutions. What this kind of a process will do is expose you to other viewpoints, other solutions that will help develop more holistic solutions with greater breadth for your clients. And finally, and this is a nice sort of consequence that happens organically, is that you will begin to improve your own problem solving skills and processes for future clients that you'll meet. Step 4. So we've moved through 3 phases now. Now we're going to develop a sample. And this is where it gets really neat. So choose a few suggestions from the ideation phase to sustain the innovative mindset as you enter into what is now coming up on the more technical phase of the plan. So ask, some questions. If you're blue sky, if we had $1 million to spend on fees, this is the one we would choose. Dig into it. If you had unlimited resources to fund a solution, what is it about that solution that is so intriguing to your client? What is it they love? Because maybe there's something that they can replicate out of that without having to have such an expansive budget. If you get in the ideation phase, some input to the effect, well, that was unexpected. That's a great thing to hear. Why was it unexpected? What was it about it that was different? Does it still work? Can we get other efficiencies off of that and other levels of effectiveness? If somebody said everybody would love to get behind this suggestion, well, what is it about that suggestion that everybody wants to get behind? Can we get that somewhere else or get some of that somewhere else? Can we stage it out and ladder it up over several years of planning? How can we achieve that same level of enthusiasm a different way if that's the way we have to go. If somebody says the most rational choice is, dig into why they think that's the most rational choice. What is it about it that seems to make the most sense? And then I've got two other answers that you might hear. And these are pretty common when you're going through the ideation phase. The one most supported by the recipients of the gift was. So if you've got, say, a generation 2 or generation 3, you're doing some intergenerational transition or estate planning, and the second and third generations really got behind a particular solution, I think it is important for you to understand what it was that they loved about that, because there are differences between generations. We all know that. And if they're going to become engaged into that, if they're going to love that, maybe we should think about that in our planning. Maybe we can achieve the outcomes of the first generation while also satisfying the goals and desires of the second generation for the plan. And finally, what was the one most supported by the wealth generation? The generation transiting the wealth from one generation to the next. We can't ignore that. We have to understand what they were prepared to get behind. And those last two choices, they often cross over one another. And we can use that to create a plan that both generations agree with. So in this phase, we may want to do some prototyping. How do we do that? Well, create some walkthrough scenarios. And what I suggest is that you have the parties. So if you're working with some estate planning, have the parents and then have their children create some scenarios. It's much, when we create scenarios, and I do this myself, I always have to catch myself. We often create things that we'd like to see, points we'd like to illustrate, things we want to drive home as important. Let your clients make the scenarios. You will see a lot of really interesting output from that, because now you're seeing what they think is important. They're telling a story when they're building their own scenarios. So watch what that reveals. For that, you can use things like storyboards, storytelling. We know that family storytelling, to the extent that it's not done, is one of the reasons that contributes to the destruction of wealth between generations in families, particularly with family businesses. The key in all of this, for example, with a role play, is that it will trigger the emotions, it'll trigger the irrational part of the important side of the planning, and the limitations that are going to be latent in the situation. So here's an example of a role play that we could use to take some of the ideas from the ideation phase and get into a planning simulation. So Billy's father did an estate freeze back in 2015. Billy received all the new common shares. The commons have grown from nil value to over $5 million in the intervening 5 years. Billy has two siblings that do not work in the business. They're moving along in their careers with modest savings via, the old standby RRSPs. In a pandemic modified Christmas dinner setting, the youngest sibling asks why they were not included in the freeze and inquires about the present value of the company. So you can feel the rumbling starting now. She then asks this question of her mother. And if you really want to make it exciting, and this is a scenario, okay, it doesn't have to be a real scenario. You're making one up and having people act this out in terms of how they would respond to these particular factual circumstances. Instead of it being the mother, make it the stepmother. And that will bring a lot of extra creativity to the situation. And what we're doing with this is we are teasing out the perceptions and expectations, as well as some of the goals and maybe baked in assumptions that our clients have and their children or their grandchildren have about the planning that's going to be done or that has been done. And then mom responds. Why are we doing this? Well, building the model or the prototype, having this particular phase, allows us to build things that force people to think more deeply about the nuances and reasons, authentic reasons for their choices. We experience the images of the stories to make it real. It's a form of communication. It also, and I am a lawyer, it keeps money away from lawyers, and that's a good thing. It allows us to fail quickly without consequences, and that's a good thing as well. And ultimately, variety is the spice of life. Having the ideation and bringing in different scenarios allows us to test different ways of looking at problems. And maybe we come to a solution that's an innovation for the family. Variables in these circumstances here, such as poor communication, maybe weak dynamics or stressed dynamics, poor decision making, can be managed early on in order to improve the ultimate planning. Step 5, beginning the test. Testing is obviously important. It's also, in an engineering standpoint, a lot easier to do. If you're building a rocket, you can test it. But when you're working with a family, particularly a family farm, on their intergenerational wealth planning or their transition planning of ownership, it's obviously a little bit harder to test. But that doesn't mean that we can't run simulations. We can't have role plays to see how things will work. One thing you might want to try is to do a fire drill if a parent dies or has a stroke or has one of those, particularly a stroke, becomes incompetent to make decisions, and they're outside of the country. Where's the information stored? On whose authority are decisions going to start being made? That's actually a fire drill that's realistic. And that gives us an opportunity to see how people are thinking about the planning. And that actually is testing elements of the plan that we're ultimately going to put into place. Because it's going to be in those crisis situations when decision making is forced against the wall and people are responding with their system one emotional responses that we see what's really going to happen. It can also be fun. And it's a way to reveal holes, understandings, and information that has to be beefed up. When you're testing the model with the client, will they know what to expect? What will they know what to do? Where are they going to find things? Will they know who to call? Client testing has the benefit of also being for them a self-reflective exercise. Is this really, they should ask themselves or may ask themselves, is this really what I wanted to achieve or to put my family through? Especially, if you have that situation where you do the fire drill based on a parent having a stroke and now decisions have to be made immediately, and we're using substitute decision documents to achieve that. The client now can see how the family is going to respond to that dynamically and then think to themselves, is this really what I wanted to have happen? Maybe it is. Sometimes it's not. Having an alternative prototype is also a great idea, and optimal if you can do it. What worked here and not there? So having alternatives, if possible, is also a fun way to test out this model. And through this process, we're always defining and refining. The first model is never going to be the perfect one. And maybe we can add features that make it better from our point of view, which was step 2, but also from the client's point of view, which through the process of empathy understanding was step number 1. So where are we after going through these 5 steps? Well, we know that these particular 7 causes of wealth destruction between generation are well known to everyone in this particular space. Wealth preservation tends to focus exclusively on financial wealth. Well, by going through a design process, we have actually dealt with that as a problem. We're actually now looking at empathetic planning. We're not focusing exclusively on the financial wealth. Families and their advisors fail to appreciate that it's a dynamic intergenerational process. We've taken that into account through a process that is encouraging ideation from multiple generations, and so on through the list. They fail to tell their stories. Storytelling, we've ticked that box because we're going to use the storytelling in the testing process to create scenarios as well. So we've ticked a lot of these boxes and dealt with the 7 known causes of destruction of wealth between generations by using this design process. This also helps to tackle the 5 mistakes, the top 5 mistakes from a decision-making process that everybody makes in their estate planning. One is that it's often inauthentic. Their neighbor did it one way. They were at Tim Hortons and their neighbor said, "Oh, I'm going to do this." And they said, "I should do this too." That's inauthentic planning. Having an idea, having a design process for your estate planning or transition planning is at its core authentic. Assuming your family will understand your intentions after you die. Well, we know that that never happens very well unless we communicate it clearly. Having a design process actually is an opportunity to share through simulations and through empathy development what our understanding is of what's going to happen after we die. That fire drill example is a great example. Planning for the assets rather than preparing the heirs and the beneficiaries. At its core, and this process of design planning takes people through their beneficiary goals and through their beneficiary needs, seeing what they were expecting, what they were hoping for. Rather, we haven't even tackled the assets yet. So we've put the horse in front of the cart from a planning perspective. 4, thinking about estate planning as an event rather than a process. The whole process of design thinking that I've just introduced for estate planning is in itself a process, a multi-step process. And finally, failing to consider the possibility of black swan events. Those are events that are catastrophically devastating to a family business, for example, that couldn't be predicted, but look like they were predictable afterwards. And that can be, something like a pandemic, but it could be even things that are more pedestrian day to day. One of the 5 Ds. So death or divorce or disability. If we go through a process of design thinking, we can challenge those scenarios. We can think about those scenarios and we can tick that box as well. So what you'll see is that this process of design planning actually tackles the 5 mistakes that everybody makes in their estate planning as well. So finally, what are the 5 steps in review? Empathize, define, go through a process of ideation, model it, and to the extent it's possible, maybe using a fire drill analysis, something like that, test it and see if it will work with various different scenarios. You will learn a lot in those final 2 steps. If you're interested in more on this, you can get my book, the Naked Opus, Growing Your Family Wealth for the Long Term, by visiting www.familywealthpress.com. And for attendees of this particular event, if you enter coupon code CAFA in capitals 2021, you will get 25% off the purchase price of the book. Thank you very much. If you want more information, this is my contact information, or I have a podcast at Inception Family Wealth Hour, available on Apple, Google, and Spotify, or most other places where you might get.
Looking to manage oil and gas development on your property? Since 2009, WellTrax has been a leading provider of oil and gas management solutions. With dedicated software, professional oil and gas administrative support, and more, we specialize in saving our clients time and maximizing income from oil and gas holdings. Get well connected today and learn how our WellTrax team can help you.